Trapani, 10 July 1943. The runway must have been just beyond the next chain of hills. I threw the 109th into a left turn and flew at low altitude over the sun-scorched surface of the meadow towards the farm building that stood beside the dried-up riverbed. Beside it was a yellow signal cloth stretched out on the ground and facing the valley. It indicated the point where we had to land. I wondered why this scorched yellow strip with dark oaks, sparsely covering the slopes on either side, seemed so small today. Yesterday it looked so much bigger when I landed on it in a gale and taxied across the rocky ground. Once out of it, I had to walk through knee-high grass and thistles that crackled as I broke and crumbled them with my feet. The length of the runway seemed adequate to me, provided you approached the signal strip at minimum speed and landed near it. I wanted to make a good landing to give the group flying behind me confidence. After that, I had to turn away quickly to make way for Baxman and Helbig, who were not too far behind me and were already making a turn before levelling the aircraft on the final approach, just before I pointed the aircraft downwards. Men in khaki came out of the door of the house, and as the wheels of the landing gear touched the ground, I saw soldiers with very pistols close to the signal strip. Their job was to immediately fire red flares if anything went wrong on the landing approach. Straydon had chosen experienced men for this task. Rolling up the slope, the plane came to a quick stop, and then I realized that the runway was too short for the overflighted pilot to take off again. He had no more than a fraction of a second at his disposal to decide to circle again and make a second attempt. My mechanic signaled to me from the shadows under the trees. I switched off the engine, unbuckled my harness, and sat on the edge of the cockpit. From there, I had a good view of what was happening on the aerodrome, and I could radio instructions to Freytig's landing party. What we were doing with our Messerschmitts on this tiny piece of land, which was called a landing pad, bordered on aerobatics. The engine was running at high revs as we had to maintain a high speed to control the aircraft. Just before the signal sheet, the throttle lever moved sharply backwards, and the heavy machine in a cloud of dust made a landing on stony, but far from smooth ground. It was a risky maneuver to which, however, our years of wandering had accustomed us. That said, the only difference for me was that I, as squadron commander, could still berate this choice or this unfortunate strip of ground from which we were expected to operate. But now it was my own choice, and that was another matter altogether. Everything seemed to go normally. Everyone knew the order of landing. The intervals between aeroplanes were appropriate to the situation, and the young pilots were repeatedly warned of the dangers of landing in such circumstances. One of the latter, after landing, immediately took off again because he had underestimated his speed. Quite rightly. The red flares slowly descended to the ground and extinguished. There were the usual clouds of dust, the crescendo and diminuendo of engines, taxiing aircraft, moving fuel tankers, screaming mechanics. A kaleidoscope of war invading this peaceful valley with the force of an explosion. For us, however, it was quite banal, even though the inconsistency of the landing strip, whose existence here was hardly thought of by anyone, made our hair stand on end. From time to time I would command into the microphone, such as "Second Squadron, steer left," or "Open up more," or "Close up again." Approximately 20 Messerschmitts landed safely. Only 2 continued to circle over the feed. In one case, the pilot had trouble releasing the landing gear. In the other, one of the rookies failed to land on the first attempt. I took off my helmet and bent into the cockpit to switch off the radio when I heard the excited shouts of the mechanics. "Not too far left. He's coming in too steep." Straightening up, I saw the 109th sitting considerably away from the signal strip. At too high a speed, it had travelled up the slope with its tail raised, and then, because of the pressure on the brakes, it shook and began to lurch. At this point, everyone held his breath, waiting for the denouement. The mechanics stopped work. The pilots in their cockpits turned their heads, watching the movement of the aircraft as it hurtled past them. The seasoned veterans knew what was about to happen, but still their faces were impassive. It will crash into the trees, I thought. Perhaps it will end up in an oak grove, or maybe the pilot will risk turning the plane sharply, and then the landing gear struts will break. But before it reached the trees, the tail of the Messerschmitt was suddenly thrust upwards, and after a second of balancing on the propeller cork, the aeroplane flipped over. All that could now be seen from the tall shrubbery were the wheels and thin landing gear struts sticking up. It had obviously hit a boulder, but how is that possible? Yesterday I did a full surface check, ruddering the S-torch in all directions. Several vehicles were already rushing towards the crash site. When I jumped down to the ground and called for transport, already at a great distance I could smell a strong odour of petrol. A group of pilots had gathered around the tail section of the aircraft, preparing to lift it by joint efforts. I could hear them shouting, "Look out for fuel leaks." "Keep your fire extinguishers ready." Together, lift. Bachmann suddenly appeared beside me. "It's probably one of the new officers," he said. "My God, do you hear that? The generator is still running. That means the ignition is still on. A single spark somewhere in the maze of wiring could have caused an explosion. The ground around the plane is already soaked with petrol. One of the mechanics, armed with a heavy tool, knelt under the wing and with furious blows smashed out the side window of the cockpit lantern. The other pilots, shrugging, held the tail in the balance. First a pair of hands emerged from the cockpit, and then a head in a flight helmet. Finally, a mechanic jerked and dragged the abrasion-covered pilot, in a petrol-soaked shirt and rags, to the... At this point, the onlookers breathed a sigh of relief. During the entire operation, numerous fire extinguishers were aimed at the crash site. We were well aware of the danger of what was happening and kept a respectful distance from the puddles of petrol. "Let's get him out of here," shouted someone, pushed forward by the arm of his saviour. The pilot rose to his knees, hitting his head on the edge of the wing. Now the fire extinguishers. One would have thought that the jets of foam had ignited the petrol vapours, for suddenly a wall of red fire, high as a house, rose up in front of us with a deafening oof, stumbling and falling. We ran to escape it. We were out of the danger zone when we saw a man running, burning like a torch. It was the pilot. After a few meters, he suddenly stopped and collapsed to the ground. Firefighters rushed to his aid and emptied fire extinguishers on the squirming man. By the time I got to him, the fire was already out. Just as I thought. It's one of the new officers," Bachmann said. "He's badly burned." Suddenly I felt the infernal nature of the action from these temporary forward runways. The squadron now had only one ambulance, and it was elsewhere. We had destroyed all our transport in Tunisia, and when we were re-equipped, all the air fleet could provide us with was one air ambulance. Every last one of us has been calling for medical duty personnel, but as yet none have arrived. Only the most essential transport had left Trapani, and the little patch of pasture, which was now our aerodrome, was hard to find. We left Hauptmann Sperling, our doctor, there to take care of the wounded who, because of the continuous raids, filled our little infirmary. The burnt pilot was put on a stretcher and carried into the shade. He was in terrible shape. Several pilots were discussing how to ease his pain. "This is Beren from my squadron," said Reinert. "He's only been with us a week and hasn't been in combat yet." Leaning over the prostrate man, I was struck by the stench of burnt flesh. The fire had done a terrible job on his head and upper torso. His hair had fused into a nose-eating mass. His face was covered in bubbles. Shreds of burnt clothing hung from his arms and chest. Between moans, he screamed, "I can't bear it. Do something to stop this pain." Again and again he repeated his pleas. While we stood around helplessly, for there was no doctor or other medical man present, and there was no one among us who could administer an injection of morphia. "Send for Straden," I ordered. "He used to give injections. Take the emergency kit from one of the planes. There should be a syringe and ampoules." Straden appeared, catching his breath. His duty now was to run the squadron's improvised command center. He realized at once what was expected of him and set to work. "Easy, lad," he said, breaking the head of the ampoule with a firm hand and filling the syringe. "Take it easy, just a minute or two more. Just a little longer." Soon the wounded man calmed down. He moaned softly, mumbling words we couldn't make out, while the technician chased away the flies that swarmed around him. His eyelids bulged. His face became an inexpressive, gelatinous mass. At last, the Storch, which we had radioed from Trapani, appeared over the field. It would carry Behrend to our infirmary. There was also a field hospital in Trapani. Perhaps they could send him to the mainland if it happened that a Junkers would arrive during the night to deliver urgently needed spare parts and evacuate the wounded. I got into the Kubelwagen and drove down the slope to the farm building where we had set up our command post. For a long time I could not get rid of the impressions of what had happened, seen telephone conversations and reports on the condition of the aeroplanes. The face of that pilot, almost a boy, kept reappearing before me, and I thought I could smell the stench of burnt flesh. Excellency. There was a staff lorry standing near the farm gate. A tent tarpaulin was stretched between it and the wall. Our deck chairs were under it. The gate, very run down, was closed and locked securely with a deadbolt. Climbing up on the top beam and pulling yourself up, you could look into an inner quadrangular courtyard surrounded by tiled cattle pens. All around lay rusty farm implements. This was rural Sicily, a peaceful sight. It was harvest time now, and one would expect to see some activity in the yard. But people were likely to flee in panic as soon as the wind picked up what we were about to do here. Since everywhere we appeared, death and destruction followed us. Freytag and his squadron commanders, along with Straten, Bachmann and Helbig, gathered in the shade of the awning. It was hot and windless. "What is known regarding the landing of the Allies?" Freytag asked. "Not much," I replied. "Not much more than we can find out for ourselves. This evening I had a few words with the general before the line was cut. He spoke of the airborne landing and parachute operations in the Augusta Capes Passerogela area. You know his couraged manner with which he views and assesses a situation, the sight of which would drive anyone else to a nervous breakdown. But this evening his voice sounded irritated and tense as he said, 'We're running an incredible barrage of fire.' Then the connection cut off. 'A glorious situation,' Freytag commented. 'Bachmann, please let me know when all the planes are refueled. How many have landed?' 24, Herr Major. 24. And how many of them were airworthy? The first group stayed in Shaka. Godert was to take off from there at dawn to attack the landing craft near Gila, and would immediately move to our forward airfield if it became impossible to stay at Shaka. The previous evening we had all gathered in the grotto, which had become our tradition since the Allied air offensive had begun. Fatty had set up an improvised kitchen in it, and now we devoured our monotonous dinners here. The last few reconnaissance flights had revealed the presence of numerous warships of all sizes in Valletta harbour and around the island. Together with the heavy bombardment and incessant flights of enemy scouts, this indicated an imminent landing. By midnight, cannons began firing from the sea with unusual intensity. The explosions shook the floor and roof of the grotto. Awakened from a deep sleep, we lay with our eyes open on our cots, all of us aware that the final stage had begun. First, the radio interception office at Mount Eris reported that the conversations on Allied radio frequencies had taken on incredible proportions. But it was obvious that the men who were relaying orders, information and warnings to each other and speaking to their control officers on the ground were not the bombing and fighter squadron commanders with whom we were already familiar, but were entirely new arrivals whose squadrons and wings we had not hitherto encountered in the Mediterranean. Then the command post, the radio platoon, and finally the first group from Shaka came into contact, and all this information, adding up, formed a picture of a battle in which the Allies had loaded themselves on ships with the intention of storming Fortress Europa. The occupants of the grotto lay motionless, waiting for the grey murk of dawn to force them out of their beds, to prepare for the day's sorties. Their eyes were fixed on my lips whenever I spoke on the telephone to the command post or received messages from the radio platoon to let them know how the situation was developing. Then they would half-heartedly discuss, or taking maps out of their cupped pockets, show Gila, for example, or Syracuse, or run their fingers along the coast in the neighborhood of Licata. We got up as the first rays of dawn began to break through an arch in the wall. Before we walked through it to the lorries to drive to the airfield, Hauptmann Kegel announced the mission for the day. Morning reconnaissance of bridgehead near Gela, reconnaissance of sea areas extending to Malta, Pantelleria and Tunis, intercept approaching bombers, flights to commence after relocating to forward airstrip. Anti-Atwo. Mer7 for the commander. Droning, I stood up and climbed the steps to the staff car. Inside, it was impossible to straighten up without hitting my head on the roof. On the map that covered the table by the window was a mottled array of red arrows, pointing south and east toward the southern part of the island. They showed the movement of pincers which allowed the enemy, who enjoyed superiority in air and sea, a free cut off the southern tip of the island. Mr. Major, we have detected a large formation of strategic bombers approaching from the southwest. The call came from the command center on Mount Eris. If you take off immediately, you'll meet them as they cross the coast. Thank you. We're taking off. I'll contact you again when we're in the air. The pilots standing by the lorry heard my reply and were ready to go. The drivers started their engines. Heavy bombers approaching from the direction of Pantelleria, I announced. There was no need for advance information to the words quick takeoff. It was understood without words. Everyone hurried to the vehicles, buttoning up their life jackets, stuffing signal ammunition into the lower leg pockets of their jumpsuits and exchanging remarks about the takeoff. A well-trained unit always took off in a particular sequence, which was practiced many times to keep the takeoff manageable, to collect in the air and dispatch the whole formation. When our squadrons were dispersed around a circular aerodrome, and most of our aerodromes, with the exception of forward runways, were of this shape. Takeoff was controlled by visually visible signals in the form of Very rockets fired from the squadron dispersal sites. It was not always possible to adhere strictly to the usual sequence, and during a quick takeoff, the aeroplanes with their tails already up were often involved in rash races on the ground. The casual spectator, witnessing this confusion for the first time, could close his eyes out of fear, but careful observation would soon show that on the whole it was a peculiar combination of training, intuition, and experience. In Russia, P-2 squadrons often approached an aerodrome undetected, because one of our forward air observation units was moving to a new location at that moment along with the infantry. For this reason, we accelerated the takeoff, in which, of course, everyone wanted to take part. Firstly, because he was anxious to shoot down the enemy, and secondly, because, even in Russia, everyone felt safer in the air than on the ground. Obviously, air combat on the Eastern Front was nothing more than a safe game compared to this hell. But, on the other hand, it could also bring some unpleasant shocks. Executing a wide left turn, I looked round and counted the aeroplanes behind me. 16. In other words, the remnants of the first group and the headquarters wing. Perhaps after this sortie there would be 10, perhaps fewer. The furniture vans are approaching the landing beachhead, crossing the coast near Selinuti. The message from our communication center on Mount Eris was very loud and clear, which was somewhat reassuring to me. Message received. I confirmed. The morning sun was shining right in my face. I moved a little on my parachute so that the windscreen binder shaded my eyes. The southern part of the island below me looked like an exquisite blue-green watercolor, its coastline gracefully highlighted by an undulating strip of white foam where the blue waves of the Mediterranean crashed against the shore. The air was crystal clear and made so close the villages. Blue-green olive groves and vineyards glided past so slowly below me that they seemed to be at arm's length and that I was motionless in the air above them. To the left, where the fertile coastal strip turned into bare, dried-up, barren terrain, the picture took on shades of dark yellow and gold. The altimeter was showing 8,000 meters. A thin white condensation trail, clearly visible against the blue sky, began to form behind Butchman's car. Undoubtedly, I should have started descending at once. Otherwise, we would have demonstrated our position to the Spitfires and Lightnings. Far ahead in a southeasterly direction, where the sun reflected off the surface of the sea, lay the bridgehead of an enemy landing. My eyes glided along the coastal highway until they stopped on a white spot. It was Jailer. In the same direction were ships, innumerable grey shadows dotting the surface of the sea. They were maneuvering at high speed, and their bows were weaving on the surface of the water like a net of long waves, spreading out into the distance as far as the eye could see. What an immense fleet! If only we had any number of bombers and undamaged aerodromes, but the ships did not fear us. There was nothing we could do to them. Odyssey, from top cover. The furniture vans should be crossing your course now. And almost immediately, Bachmann came on the radio. Odyssey, a large number of furniture vans at 9 o'clock. Now I could see the bombers heading for Messina too. They were flying in battle order with a ledge to the left at a considerable distance and were echeloned in altitude at 900 meters. It took a few minutes for us to catch up with them, and I mechanically began to make the usual calculations concerning approach, attack, engagement, and withdrawal. But where could we retreat to? It was more than likely that Camiso was unusable, as it was already threatened by ground troops, while Jabini, with its many spare aerodromes, had been emptied only the day before. So it had to be either an advanced airstrip or even Trapani. As I made a gentle turn towards the harbour, I saw that Freytag's group had already set off in pursuit. Behind me were only Bachmann and Helbig. At that moment I saw about 100 meters below me a single Boeing, perhaps late in taking off or delayed due to technical problems. It was now flying bravely behind the main force. I knew I had to pursue the main formation and not leave Freytag alone. If the single aircraft continued on its way, we would in any case meet him later. But the general's words still rang in my ears: you must shoot down the bombers. That's 10 crewmen carried by each of them. I did a flip over the wing and spun out of an ideal attack position. My feverish desire for victory pushed aside all other thoughts, except the brief thought that the pitiful remnants of my squadron were now preparing to attack the armada of flying fortresses. The Boeing held steady in my sights. I had taken the firing button off the safety beforehand and now opened fire, although it was too early for my shots to have any effect. However, the sounds of the shots quickly ceased. My guns had jammed. Only the machine guns continued to fire. The smell of cordite filled the cabin. As I gained altitude, I saw the fortress still flying its course and apparently unharmed. And at that moment, like long fingers, Bachmann's smoked tracers reached for her wings and engines, and a thin, white trail of escaping fuel could be seen streaming behind the right outer engine, but the big plane stayed on course as if nothing had happened. Helbig opened fire from 300 meters, beyond the range of his guns. Now it was my turn again. As if I was guilty of something and wanted to put an end to the unequal contest and at the same time give it a chance, I swooped down like a textbook and got a few meters closer. But why wasn't anyone firing from the tail turret? The keel of the bomber loomed in front of my windshield like a tree. The turbulent currents created by its engines tossed my plane. My hand clutched the control stick, and I pressed the throttle. The cannons jammed again after firing. My machine guns sprayed a hail of sparks across the aluminium skin of the giant plane before I had to go overhead. Thanks to my speed, I flew well ahead of my opponent. When I turned the machine round and looked down, I saw that he had begun a majestic turn. Now Bachmann was behind him again. Without flinching, he hovered a few meters behind the aircraft that was making the turn, firing at the damaged engine with everything he had. White jets of escaping petrol marked his hits. The propeller of the engine that had been his target spun slower and finally came to a standstill. By this time, the American had reversed course and was trying to get away in the direction of Pantelleria. We fired a few more bursts into his fuselage, but without success. We were still at an altitude of 4,000 meters when we crossed the coast. The bomber, a flying wreck with petrol flowing behind two engines, after all the tracers we had fired, did not catch fire. I wondered how many of the 10-man crew were still alive in that flying coffin. Surely the pilot, protected in the back by an armoured spine. But I'd forgotten that our time was running out. Get out of the attack. Get out of the attack. I ordered and turned northwest, towards our forward airstrip. As the airfield appeared below me, I could hear scraps of phrases and the rumble of battle over the radio. Freytag's group was still fighting. A quarter of an hour later, 12 of the 16 Mies that had flown out returned. I heard someone say, "Hauptmann Freytag is missing in action." The word-of-mouth news reached the staff car before the pilots arrived to report. "We flew right into the thick of the Spitz," said von Kester, a young, lanky lieutenant. "After that I lost sight of Hauptmann Freytag. It was more like a farce than an air battle, and everyone was firing from every possible position. The Spitz was staggered when we appeared." "No. Did anyone see a parachute?" "No, Mr. Major. At any rate not during the fight with the Spitz." "Dictate the combat reports to the staff clerk, please, and after that make sure your aeroplanes are ready to take off again as soon as possible." The midday heat was becoming unbearable. We had sunk into our deck chairs and were now resting silently and without any thoughts. The airfield telephone continued to ring as squadrons went out to report technical defects and the completion of refueling. We were to fly 1 or 2 more patrol sorties and then return to Trapani. We had long since stopped discussing our sorties, say the combat order in which we flew, or the attack, or the combat itself. We were so exhausted by the daily hopeless routine, now performed like automatons, that although we recorded what we saw and experienced, we did so without comment. In any case, what, rightly, was there to discuss or spread about? We were the few who, for various reasons, were still surviving. To some extent we were the dregs of the once famous Southern fighter aviation, which was adorned with the names of the famous Marcellus and Munchenberg. However, the calculations were again wrong, as in Stalingrad and Tunisia. In the eyes of the Reichsmarschall, we were mere disciplinary battalions whose actions could no longer be assessed by expressions of praise or censure, but deserved only contempt. The news about Freytag depressed me. I had found an easy way out by attacking a single aeroplane instead of pursuing the main group and thus reinforcing our position. Had he been here, no doubt he would have made some ironic remarks about my actions. They were, after all, well considered to be acceptable within the confines of informal commander-subordinate relations. Perhaps he would have said, "You've picked a glorious tidbit for yourself," or "It's incredible why those heavy bombers are holding out. 3 fighters scorching all their ammunition and nothing?" Actually, too. To my right in the Chai's lounge sat Buckman. This young jolly fellow had hitherto met the events calmly and serenely, but now his face was so gaunt that it looked almost martyr-like. His fingers drummed nervously on the armrest of the chaise. When I put my hand over his to restrain it, he turned to me and made the remark I least expected to hear in this situation. "If I ever get out of here, Herr Major," he said, "if I ever get out of here, I'm going straight to Berlin. I need a woman. I've been looking forward to it ever since Alamein." "You must have done something about it when you were in Bari," remarked Straden. "Oh, don't talk to me about Italian women. It's a great adventure. We liked them when we were boys and used to read Karl Mayer. We were going, in the service of the Führer, to conquer distant countries and find booty, like the Greeks in the Trojan War." The staff clerk came in to report that 12 vehicles were ready for departure. A little later, the squadron's technical officer got out of the Kübelwagen and, with a groan, leaned his back against the wall opposite me and sank to the ground. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand. "The situation with spare parts of all kinds is catastrophic, Mr. Major," he said. "Not enough ammunition, not enough coolant and hydraulic fluid. If nothing changes within a couple of days, we'll have to close the workshop." Within a couple of days, my friend, "The workshop will be closed one way or another," said Straydon in a deafening voice. After that, the conversation stopped again. The telephone rang incessantly. The command post continued its usual work, and we could hear individual words. For example, bolt replacement, which were interspersed with snippets of conversations with the command post on Mount Eris. The liaisons were able to re-establish the line, which was almost a miracle. Several pilots began to talk quietly. "Didn't anyone see what happened to Freytag?" someone asked, or Behen's car hit a rock. "He was going too fast and landed away from the landing strip." Tea, melons and white bread were delivered from the field kitchen. We ate sluggishly, without appetite. The fiery ball of the sun hung directly overhead. What could I do with the remnants of my squadron? Should we fight to the last car? Instead of wasting the last squadron-sized airworthy force against enemy formations, it would be better to find a noteworthy alternative that took into account our capabilities. We were to return to Trapani at dusk, provided they managed to keep the runway clear. Our tasks for the next day were the same: reconnaissance over the landing beachhead, assaulting ground targets, defending the Strait of Messina from bomber strikes. Movement across the strait was vital if our intention was to hold the island, and was even more important if we were going to evacuate the island. In the event that the general and his staff moved north, our battle reports would be transmitted by radio. They should be short and to the point and include information about the situation. But unlike Wehrmacht reports, they would be nothing about heroic resistance or crushing losses suffered by the enemy. I feared that the island would be held at all costs, because the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces had decided so, and that the evacuation order would come again when there was nothing to evacuate and nothing to save. No telephone. Lieutenant Buckman? A little later the adjutant returned and said, "The first group request permission to join us here. They have just survived a terrifying raid by marauders and say they would like to find a peaceful place in this country where they can breathe in peace." "There are already too many cars on this pocket handkerchief," I objected loudly. "Where are we going to put them?" Stratton said skeptically. "This will be the last straw that overflows the cup. What happens if the Kitty Hawks discover us here when they fly out on an assault or reconnaissance mission?" However, the refusal contradicted my view that we should concentrate all our combat-ready forces. Too much valuable flying time was being wasted while we reached the rendezvous point from various aerodromes. "They have no other escape options," Buckman said. I authorized it. In this situation, where there was no overall control, each commander had to make his own decisions and take personal responsibility for his actions. An hour must have passed when the first group appeared. Having made a circle over the aerodrome, it landed, fortunately without incident. It was Kohler and Godert along with 13 other pilots, all that was left of the group. Godert ducked sharply under the awning to announce his arrival, then pulled his life jacket over his head and unbuttoned his soaked shirt at the waist. As he did so, he revealed a belly adorned with a pale blue tattoo of a beautifully shaped woman in a sensual pose. She had obviously been born in Hong Kong or Shanghai when her owner was in the merchant navy. Beads of sweat covered Goet's forehead. "I'm sorry I'm sweating so much," he said, "but I was worried about the landing." After him, Kohler squeezed under the awning and made a feeble attempt to greet those present. By now this soft, sensitive man was a mere shadow of himself in the past. In the diffused light under the awning his face looked almost chrome yellow. With the aid of huge doses of atibrine, he was fighting a desperate battle with malaria. It was involved in every possible sortie. "This morning I got one of those low-speed, gay-like Americans," he said. "It was total chaos when we encountered anti-aircraft fire. As expected, we fired on the landing craft and found out how far off the coast the Yanks had advanced. There's every last one of them firing at anybody up there. There are splendid gliders on the shore and on the shoals. We shelled the whole motorway to Agrigento. It was an aeroplane adjusting artillery fire from warships. It was hovering up and down over the coastal motorway. Arming quickly took up a position behind it, and it fell like a ball of fire, said the usually unflappable Godot with a touch of excitement. When we crossed the hills on our way to the coast, we could see their fat-looking fighter bombers on the right below doing their thing, so we could relay where our own forces were. But there was a hell of a lot of confusion, and no real front line could be detected. Light anti-aircraft artillery fires at everything it sees, and if you show up next to big ships, there seems to be an avalanche of fire coming at you. Fighter bombers from Malta and Pantelleria, most of them Grumman martlets. They are thick, low-maneuvering planes carrying incredible bomb loads. On our first patrol, we bombarded the landing craft. When they are low in the water and packed with troops, they're excellent targets. How many aeroplanes can you get in the air? No, I'll be more than happy if I can get a dozen in order, Herr Major, replied Godot. They really ploughed our shaka today. We were already sitting in the cabins, ready to fly out on the second patrol, when our old friends marauders from North Africa appeared overhead without warning. Their aiming, as always, was abominable. Our 88s opened fire and gave them a good kicking. Soon there were 10 parachutes over the runway. 2 bombers crashed near the aerodrome. In return, they left a hole in my wing big enough for your head to fit through. Very good. We should be ready to take off again as soon as possible. The command post from Mount Eris keeps reporting the appearance of one wave after another. Trapani has already been bombed twice. Kitty hawks. We didn't hear the sound of their engines, but suddenly they appeared in a formation just above our airfield at an altitude of no more than 90 meters. They were evidently returning to Pantelleria. Their bellies were painted blue, and as the leader moved his aircraft into a deep turn, we could see the mottled desert camouflage on the upper surfaces. We froze, hoping we wouldn't be spotted. If we opened fire with our machine guns and rifles, we would expose ourselves. In any case, our airfield defences were largely improvised and consisted of a few MG-15s on tripods mounted along the landing strip and rifles with which our mechanics were armed. They're coming in, stretched out like beads in a necklace. The Americans were now coming up the valley in a keeled column. Stumbling over chairs and wires, we rushed under the defence of the wall and reached it with a few powerful leaps. The enemy's guns started simultaneously, as if on command, then our own machine guns joined in. We pressed against the wall, holding our breath while the bullets raised fountains of earth from the hard ground around the farmhouse. Sharp-nosed fighters. There must have been about a dozen swept over the aerodrome, the unfamiliar sound of American engines filling the long valley. By this time our men had opened fire with their rifles, as they had been trained to do, from the trenches, from crevices in the ground, and from shelters under trees. I think this was not a particularly effective method of defence, but at least it was excellent for morale. One could only expect success when everyone was firing, so that as much lead as possible was directed upwards. The Russians did the same and acted annoyingly on us as we stormed their positions. "Attention, they're coming back," wailed one of the observers. They made a climbing turn and, coming in from the east, opened fire at long range. We rushed round the farm building to take cover this time behind its western wall. This situation was becoming amusing. No doubt they had attacked the farmhouse and the staff car, assuming perhaps the presence in them of a radio station vital to controlling the progress of the battle. But undoubtedly they could not fail to spot our poorly camouflaged aeroplanes under the trees. Swearing and panting, we rushed into the ditch as a hail of bullets tore up the ground around the farmhouse and the dry grass on the runway. "Bloody idiots," cursed someone. "If only we could take off." "Heads up, they're splitting up. They're coming in from both sides," apparently intent on tearing the innocent rural farm apart. The Americans were now attacking from different directions, chasing us around the barn. We kept galloping away, saving our lives, swearing and laughing. Fortunately, none of our opponents had bombs under their fuselage, so we could afford to treat what was happening with some levity. Finally, after a furious, frenzied crescendo, they all disappeared in a westerly direction, and the sound of their engines very soon died down. We gathered round the staff car, shaking the dust off our sweat-soaked shirts and trousers, and looking at the wretched, bullet-riddled lorry and its broken windows. The punctured tyres had caused it to tilt to one side, and we thought we would have to abandon it if it turned out that the engine was also damaged. Bachman was the first to raise his voice. "No damn amateurs," he said contemptuously, and we all laughed in agreement. Carl is hurt," shouted someone from the other end of the landing strip. "We need bandages and we're going to need Storch." "Everyone knows Carl," I said. "We have to hurry." Carl was brought in and laid on the ground with a seat cushion under his head. He looked round frightened, trying to say something, but all he could do was gurgle. "You mustn't speak," said Oberfeldfechtbelhamann. "Lie still, soon there will be a storm." He turned to me. The bullet went through the chest diagonally. We used all the bandages we could find, but it's still bleeding. Karl Ramhardt had been with the squadron since it entered the war in 1939. He grew up in the centre of Munich, near the market, worked with a coal merchant. More specifically, he was one of those men with blackened faces and sacks over their heads, worn like a hood, who delivered sacks of coal to people's basements and had a physique suited to the job. He was posted to the squadron, where he worked first in the kitchen and later in the clothing depot, then trained as a motor driver, favouring the big tankers. He soon became one of the squadron's indispensable members. But what gave Karl a special position among us was his inherent form of communication. He addressed anyone, including senior officers. As it wasn't that Karl didn't take rank into account, it was just that he easily and cleverly combined freedom of address with the customary signs of attention when talking to his seniors. And all this in the most pronounced of Munich pronunciations. It was noticeable that his schoolmasters had never managed to impress upon him some of the rules. Not only was he universally popular, but he was also a model of selfless dedication to his work and willingness to help others. I was among those for whom he had a special feeling. Karl," I said, leaning over him, "lie still and don't talk. We're going to airlift you to Trapani. It's better there than here." His face was contorted with a grimace of pain, and he breathed with difficulty. His powerful arms, which handled the heavy fuel barrels so casually, moved restlessly. It was clear he wanted to talk to me. Drawing my ear close to his lips, I barely heard him speak hoarsely. Major, when I am well again, I would like to go back to the boys." "Do you promise, Herr Major?" "Yes, Karl, don't worry. You'll be back with us again in a few weeks." Ete. We reached Trapani just before dusk, we being a handful of pilots with still airworthy aeroplanes. Unable to determine where to land, I made several circles over the ploughed-out airfield until green flares flew up from the dispersal area indicating that the runway markers could be trusted and that landing was permitted. It's amazing how much this airfield has endured, I thought, when after a few loud exhausts the propeller stopped. For the last 14 days the enemy had been sprinkling in it several times a day with bombs of all calibres, yet we were still able to take off and land. There was a lesson in air tactics in this, I thought, but doubted if I would ever be able to use it. The lesson being that there is little use in destroying the enemy's aerodromes unless you hit and destroy most of his aeroplanes. Our enemies admittedly succeeded in complying with this requirement, but we were still flying and still causing them losses, which in turn forced them to carry out further raids on our airfields. The British and Americans, however, had quite sufficient resources not to care about saving money. They were unlikely to stop until they had destroyed or driven us off. The sun had just set, and it seemed that its red-setting light painted the rocks, fields and houses on the slopes of Mount Eris with a glowing colour. The area around the aircraft caponiers looked outwardly like a lunar landscape. One wall of a barracks had been torn out and the roof, stripped of its support, had collapsed and was sticking upwards. The wreckage of aeroplanes was piled near the mangled trees, forming a whitish heap. Canisters and ladders were scattered on the earthen protective ramparts. It was obvious that the refueling trucks, if we still had any undamaged refuelers left, no longer had the ability to drive into the shelters. The technicians rolled petrol barrels there and began the arduous procedure of refueling with hand pumps. Today was a bloody day, Herr Major, said the non-commissioned officer, still working. It seemed that he hardly had to watch what he was doing, so professional were his movements. These were the few moments when the mechanics worked together with their pilots. On such occasions, the necessity of the common task erased all distinctions of rank and responsibility, and they could speak to them in the same lively, short phrases they used in communicating with each other. In this way, they learnt something of the fighting and could participate in the fate of the squadron to which they belonged. So what happened to Hauptmann Freytag? They could ask, or what's going on at the landing beachhead? How far did the Yanks get? At the same time, they did not hesitate to express their views on the course of the war in the most explicit terms. This is as bloody a massacre as we had 2 months ago in North Africa. What do they reckon we can do with the few aeroplanes we have left? They seem to see everything in a rosy light. I was not satisfied with the performance of my engine and sent for Oberfiedbel Hackel, who was magically handling the engine of the Daimler-Benz 109th. He was like a diagnostician and rarely ever failed to determine the cause of a malfunction after its symptoms had been described to him. If one heard in the gloom somewhere on an aerodrome the sound of an engine, now reaching its maximum revolutions and then stalling again, and if it happened 3 or 4 times in succession, one could be sure that it was Hackel examining one of his patients, coming over to see that he had stuck his head into its innards and his hands and forearms were covered with oil and grease. The engine is still out of whack, I told him, even after replacing the bushings. As soon as I go over 5,000, it starts to stall. But it's not because of a drop in fuel pressure. The mechanic installed another pump yesterday, and it's no use. Meanwhile, the techs had changed the subject and were now discussing Foju, our base on the mainland where there are no cobblestones and corpses, but there are places to drink and real live girls. But alas, these were nothing more than soldiers' dreams, in reality, and things were very different there now. "Let's try it now," said Haeckel, climbing onto the wing and from there into the cockpit. "Launch," he shouted. The inertial starter whined and the engine started, spewing a dense cloud of soot and blue-black smoke from the exhaust ports. By this time, the members of our ground crew, usually referred to by the pilots simply as mechanics, had gathered round again, for they had been so much involved in the fate of this aeroplane and in the fate of the man who flew it. They endowed this inanimate masterpiece of aluminium, steel, plastic, and many hundreds of meters of wires with human qualities, calling it she as if it were a woman. They also attributed the pilot's successes to her, and they were the ones who made sure to update the victory marks on the vertical plumage. At least that's what they did until recently. From constant observation, they knew a great deal about the aircraft and its features and made no allowance when someone destroyed or damaged it through carelessness or inexperience. The observation of ground maintenance personnel was often a more effective factor in training a pilot than disciplinary action by the squadron commander. I remember how the mechanics once walked away shaking their heads when the young pilot of the 109th, who was deaf to their advice, failed to compensate during takeoff for the aircraft's turn in reaction to propeller torque, and as a result broke the landing gear. Even now that the aircraft had become a disposable item, they still had a sense of responsibility and pride in their work. Since we returned to Sicily, they had worked almost continuously, drenched in sweat, surrounded by dust and oil and petrol fumes, with little time to sleep. Many times during the day they ran for cover for fear, when they came out of finding all their hours of work undone by one small bomb. Ever since in North Africa, we had devised a scheme for placing mechanics in the fuselage to transport them to Europe. A special relationship had developed between the ground staff, who thus escaped death or capture, and the pilots. I do not know who suggested the use of fighter planes as a kind of air transport to Sicily. But when this was decided, we began to estimate how many people we should give the chance, if authorized, to evacuate from North Africa. Before the first attempt, specialists from various services formed a group of interested spectators around the aeroplane which was to be used for a test load of guinea pig as a future passenger. First, the armor plate behind the pilot's head was removed, and then the bottom of the small baggage compartment behind the cockpit. This allowed the guinea pig to kneel in the narrow fuselage of the 109th behind the pilot's shoulders. Landing was akin to an acrobatic stunt, as it first required us to stick our feet through the narrow hatch through which the radio station was serviced. We soon realized that one should not wear nail-lined boots or shoes, as the wearer's feet were close to the main compass and the metal could cause false readings. Kneeling, one began to experience tingling and tearing in the feet after a while, but the flight time was less than an hour and could be endured. It was then that an ingenious mind discovered that, if necessary, another place could be found for someone very small, in the darkness of the tail section of the fuselage, where the rods leading to the tail rudders ran, and where the recess of the tail wheel, originally designed to be cleaned, was located. Here, too, the experiment was successful, but it was necessary, of course, to observe a certain consistency in both landing and positioning. All these activities caused much hearty laughter, though there was no cause for merriment in the situation which made them necessary, nor in our prospects for the future. Then we began our search for very small mechanics and proceeded to make detailed passenger lists. An aircraft loaded in this way had its center of gravity altered, so that takeoff and landing became dangerous activities requiring great flying skill. Rayner earned widespread admiration when, despite his overloaded aircraft with 2 mechanics on board, he engaged the enemy and shot down a Kitty Hawk. However, many of the fitters and radio mechanics, who had so fervently requested to fly over to Sicily, were later killed in bombing raids on the island. From these flights onwards, members of the ground maintenance crew always spoke of the pilot as their own, even if he was no longer alive. N.A. This evening, almost everyone who had flown into Trapani from the forward airstrip was gathered in the grotto. Godot and the pilots of the first group were also with us, because the Shakhtar aerodrome was no longer usable. At dusk, the warships started shelling from the sea. So pretty big things they're hurling, said Godot, almost certainly from cruisers or battleships. The muffled rumble of the regular bursts, quite different from the noise of bomb blasts, was unnerving. We had no communication with the fighter aircraft inspector since midday. The liaisons kept searching on various frequencies, then making contact with 2nd Air Fleet HQ, then losing it again and continuing to search the airwaves. The British fleet was apparently shelling the coastal defences, which could have meant a prelude to the landing at Marsala or a manoeuvre to divert our forces. Though we were all dead tired, no one thought of sleep. The rumble of the ship's guns rolling in from the sea and the noise of explosions precluded any rest or relaxation. At dawn, we had to fly out again for reconnaissance, even though we did not know to whom we would have to report our findings. With our few remaining aircraft, we must continue to attack the bombers. We did not need any orders regarding this. Not far from the forward airstrip which the Kitty Hawks had discovered this morning, Straden had found a meadow on which he thought the remnants of the squadron could be accommodated. We intended to fly there at dawn and operate from there, provided that the Allies had not meanwhile landed at Marsala, and that we still had enough aeroplanes left to make effective sorties. I needed to contact the fighter aircraft inspector and find out whether it was true that the Americans had advanced far north and had reached the center of the island, thus threatening to cut our forces in two. Keeping this possibility in mind, I gave orders as to the plan, which provided that the ground staff of the squadron, in all available transport, were to withdraw by road along the north coast to Messina, while the pilots were to continue to fly until there were no aircraft left fit to fly. Unless I could find out something about the current situation, I would have to rely on information gleaned from our own intelligence. At night, even the usual grim humor wore off. Anxiety, overt or covert in varying degrees, haunted us like a nightmare. Now everyone, following an uncomplicated train of thought and weighing all the possibilities, realized that the situation had become extremely serious. They took Freitag's departure as an omen of misfortune. Indeed, none of us ever thought that anything could have happened to him in flight or in battle. If he had been fortunate enough to jump out by parachute and land on solid ground, we would doubtless have learnt of it by now, everyone in those circumstances doing their best to report to his unit. Today, as always, he would be wearing his immaculate white golfers and yellow sandals that had so often been the object of my criticism. Teresa dropped a few tears when she was told of Freytag's unfortunate fate. She is a girl of a strange, absent-minded, and phlegmatic character, an ordinary child of the Sicilian village and people, and perhaps the experiences of this terrible war are too much for her little mind. She now sat silently beside her grandmother, staring blankly before her. No one in the grotto felt any desire to drink more marsala or vermouth than was necessary to quench their thirst. In any case, most of the contents of the bottles prepared for us by Fatty were always drunk by Freytag. By midnight, the enemy had evidently decided to give their crews some sleep. The shelling had slackened and only a few guns continued to fire. Eventually they too fell silent, by which time even our irritants had abandoned duty and flown home to tunnies or Bizerte. As the noise died down, tension subsided and exhaustion, combined in most with a healthy constitution, put all present into a short, dreamless sleep. Only a few were unable to sleep, but they remained in the grotto, as there was no point in going back to the flats for the remainder of the night. Besides, the Wellingtons might start bombing again, and they would have to go back. Hauptmann Kegel appeared and sat down beside my cot to report on his inspection of Jebini aerodrome. He spoke in a whisper so as not to disturb the sleepers while polishing his glasses. In the sing-song tone of a native Saxon, he described his flight to Jebini and the terrible picture of desolation he found there. "I think we will be able to land at Jebini," he said, "because the commandant and his men keep clearing 1 or 2 runways. They've even got a few working units that have casualties as well. It's only the boys, a damned disgrace. If you patrol over the Straits of Messina, you should only drop your outboard fuel tanks in an extreme situation. Or, of course, get out of the fight in time, because I doubt you'll be able to land again otherwise. Barely one batch of heavy bombers leaves Jebini as another one appears overhead. You'd think they had too many of them. The air will probably be a safer place tomorrow than the ground." Trapani, 11 July 1943. At about 5 o'clock on the morning of 11 July, Straydon and I taxied to the runway, preparing to take off for Sardinia. During takeoff his wheel tire burst, and after informing me of this by radio, he turned back to land. I decided to fly alone, and soon the coast of Sicily dissolved behind me into the sea. I slowly climbed to 6,000 meters so that I could see the coast of Sardinia as soon as possible. The nights were short. The bombing allowed us only a short sleep, and as a fighter unit commander I had to devote the night hours and integral paperwork. The further I flew northwest, the more my tension subsided, and soon a sense of serenity enveloped me. What could one expect from flying over 300 kilometers over water when there was very little chance of trouble from Spitfires or Lightnings? It was a relaxing excursion. I adjusted myself on the rigid parachute so that I could stretch my legs comfortably, then checked my oxygen mask. The propeller pitch was carefully adjusted and matched as closely as possible to the RPM of the engine, which hummed without the slightest hint of vibration. Outside at 6,000 meters it was very cold, probably 30 degrees. I slowly closed the radiator flaps. If the increase in coolant temperature was barely noticeable, my speed increased by about 6 kilometers per hour. Directly below me the sea looked as green as grass, changing further towards the horizon its colour to an inky blue. To a sailor, the complete absence of foam crests would indicate a wind strength of 1 to 2. The armour plate protecting the head and neck cast a wide shadow on the dashboard. The propeller, a shiny transparent disc, reflected the bright sunlight, dust and sand having stripped it completely of its original coating of black paint, leaving bare metal. Suddenly my headphones came to life, making me flinch. Heavy bombers in square 1217, heading 120. Fighter escort. This was the command centre on Mount Eris, relaying instructions to the fighters in Sicily. I could also hear the indistinct voices of some of the pilots, and then everything went quiet again. The cold began to sink along my back somewhere towards my kidneys. My shirt, which had been damp when I took off, was now like an ice pack around my waist. I pulled down the rolled-up sleeves of my shirt and unfolded the map in my lap. Another 100 kilometres to the coast of Sardinia, I estimated, and then another 40 to Group 3's forward airstrip. Urban didn't know I was flying, so this had to be one of those surprise visits that were part of any commander's duties. In the past, such days of visiting dignitaries had brought a lot of excitement and sometimes a lot of noise, but we had long ago given up such things. After our unsuccessful massed sortie on 25 June, Urban and his group returned to Sardinia because the ports of Cagliari and Olbia were favourite targets for four-engined bombers, and also because the possibility of a landing on Sardinia could not be ruled out. Now, at a turning point in the course of the battle, he was to fly to Gerbini the following day to help cover the Straits of Messina. The general consensus was that it was like robbing Peter to pay Paul, and we would still have to pay the price for leaving Sardinia undefended, although it was improbable that the Allies could launch two large landings almost simultaneously. But we expected the impossible from our ground services. Only certain mechanics of my squadron could be sent to Gerbini by land, for in the absence of transport aeroplanes, it was impractical to send more technical personnel than the bare minimum necessary on a journey which would take several days. He had to be spared. At Gerbini, our aeroplanes were to be taken care of by the 53rd Fighter Squadron in addition to their own. At Trapani, a sufficient number of ground maintenance crews and working workshops had to remain to refuel, rearm and maintain our machines upon our return. Finally, we still had to keep some people at the forward takeoff and landing area so that we could at least land there, refuel and take off again. We simply did not have a rational ground organization for this type of warfare, but it was useless to think about it now. My outboard tank was empty. I pressed the ignition button to check the magneto and saw that the engine speed had not changed. Every time I took a breath, the two pale yellow discs at the top of the oxygen machine closed and opened like lips, indicating that oxygen was flowing into my mask. I felt inexpressibly tired. To drive away the sleep that was coming on, I began to rotate my head and move my shoulders as vigorously as the tension of the straps allowed. At the same time, I began to speak aloud. "Gentlemen, I've come here to inform you of the situation. I've spoken to the general and he is completely on our side. He is going to speak to the Reichsmarschall as soon as he gets back to Berlin." What nonsense! As if it mattered to us what the Reichsmarschall or anyone else might or might not think of us. Why shouldn't they leave us to do our damn duty in that coffin until the last pilot was killed on the island and the last aircraft was a pile of rubble? If that's what the High Command demanded, all great and well. But they could at least, in doing so, I certainly wasn't prepared to say something like that to the pilots after I arrived, although that's probably what they expected me to say. They were just the words of a man talking alone to himself when his lone plane was 6,000 meters above the Mediterranean. I was struck by the emptiness of the sea. There was not a single ship anywhere in sight. These waters had long been controlled by the Allies, the Italians daring to leave their harbours only at night. Far ahead, the coast of Sardinia rose from the dark blue water in a thin, thin line. Now I could begin to descend. As I approached the landing signal sheet, 30 minutes later, I could see the air shimmering over the gentle hills and the sparse trees covering them. The character of the landscape of Sardinia was quite different from that of Sicily. It was softer, smoother, and somewhat resembled a steppe in its monotony. The tall grass was parched and yellow, and the moist air flowed under a merciless, searing sun. In the shade of squat cork oaks stood large, sand-coloured tents. To anyone accustomed, as I was, to nothing but broken aerodromes, ruined houses and aeroplanes, it was a peaceful picture. To the accompaniment of a few exhausts, the propeller stopped and the waiting mechanic climbed up on the wing to help me remove my gear and get out of the cockpit. Hauptmann Ubben stood nearby and, as I jumped to the ground, reported. third group in combat-ready condition, 17 aeroplanes fit for departure. Then, in a less official tone, he added, "Today the Sirocco began to blow. It is more than 38 in the shade." The hot desert wind blew over the plain. The sky turned yellow and the shadows cast by the trees became diffuse. This was something I hadn't noticed when I flew up. "I'd better talk to the pilots," I said. "Very well, Mr. Major. Perhaps you'd better move to the command center under the trees. It's a little cooler there. In the meantime, I'll call the pilots." In the tent, I was given a glass of tea with lemon. It was lukewarm, strong, and without sugar. For the last few weeks, we had found this drink pleasant. Soon the pilots, the team doctor, and the maintenance officer were sitting in a semicircle around me. The hot wind was blowing the yellow tarpaulin stretched between the oak trees. The sunlight made the tarp shine with a yellowish-brown glow, and this colour was reflected on their faces. Unvarnished, I informed them of the situation in Sicily. I told them that the Allies were attacking our aerodromes day and night, and that, consequently, we had to be constantly on guard if we did not want to be destroyed on the ground. I explained to them in detail the General's intentions and the possibilities which the flexible use of aerodromes and forward runways and the concentration of our forces, so far as a massive gathering of aircraft on one aerodrome was permissible, were to offer. There was little hope. I continued that we would make much of an impression on the heavy bombers with our few machines since the fortresses had appeared, and their clear numerical superiority meant that any air battle was now a big battle. However, we could still force the enemy to divert some of their forces to pin us down, and that could help in the defense of the island. They listened quietly, asking no questions. Exactly 30 pilots, officers and non-commissioned officers, sat in front of me and looked at me, expecting a frank conversation. Most of them I knew by name. 3 months earlier, I had stood before them in North Africa and discussed the prospects of battle. I did not know what to say to them then, and I did not try to raise vain hopes. Every commander worthy of the rank did not do so again after these years of war. We left such statements to the High Command, whose only wisdom consisted of ruinous use and excessive demands. As in the previous case, I gave them no hope that the situation would improve in any way. The recognized veterans among them, as well as myself, realized the inevitability of defeat. Now, however, there were several young faces, ill-acquainted with me. Should I say something to these newcomers? Perhaps encourage them. By now, most of them must have realized why they had been sent here from their fighter-flying schools. But the really essential lesson, namely the ability to stay alive without being accused of being overly cautious, could only be learnt from the veterans during the daily sorties. There was little use in talking about the difficulties on other fronts, for that was always the case in one way or another. Ranting to these men, uttering sentimental and sounding phrases, was no better than lying to them. They knew what had to be done the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and all they wanted to hear was whether they still had a chance, or whether inhuman demands would be made upon them. On top of that, they were skeptical, and it was obvious from their facial expressions that they were weighing and evaluating my words. They asked me to tell them what the situation was really like, whether the battle had any prospects of success, and even if there were no such prospects and everything looked black, they wanted to know the truth. Well, why not tell them everything? I knew I wouldn't be misinterpreted. The veterans, those who had flown since the early days of the war, understood my brief account of the situation and the actions of our fighters against superior forces anyway. They understood what was meant by use of forward runways, flexibility in our actions, and concentration of our remaining forces. They knew that these words meant trying to survive against all odds. They also knew that they had to fly in close formation if they wanted to get through to the bombers, and that this tactic was both necessary and correct. But they also knew that such measures could no longer balance the scales. And because they understood all this, it took only a few minutes to say all that was necessary. Having finished, I released the pilots to talk to Ubin about the next day's sortie and the action in Sicily. All 3 fighter groups that made up my squadron differed markedly from each other, even though the number of their victories was almost identical. The third group always operated separately from the squadron headquarters, and this fact put a special mark on its officers and non-commissioned officers, who obviously realized their privileged position and were more confident and reserved than their counterparts in the other two groups. Anyone could sense that they meant to say, "Just leave us alone. We'll handle everything just fine." Now they were back in the wilderness, miles and miles away from the nearest town and any German support units. Their home was a patch of Sardinian plain from which they were flying out against an apparently invincible stream of four-engined bombers, and doing so without a murmur. The next day, however, they were to face something new. Constant attempts to achieve the unattainable, frantic jumps from one aerodrome to another as long as it was still possible. 82. The long line of the eastern coast of Sardinia glided past the tip of my starboard wing as I slowly gained altitude before setting course. After 20 minutes, the southernmost tip of the island should have appeared to starboard, but the sirocco hid everything in clouds of yellow dust that were now rising directly towards the sun in the south. The third group command post went on the comms to warn me of the lightnings that had recently appeared over the island. There was crackling in my headphones. The radio was working to receive and pick up movement in the air. A woman's voice began to count. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't supposed to leave at noon in the heat of the day. Plus, I hadn't slept at all during the Group 3 visit. As I taxied to the runway and turned my 109 around with its nose against the wind, sweat poured down my face, chest and back. Now at my current altitude, I was starting to feel cold again. Flying was becoming a nasty business when there was no horizon or visual reference point to determine the position of the aircraft, and I needed another hour to reach Trapani. Quite enough time to reflect on the morning's events, during which I had moodiness and depression lurking somewhere in the back of my mind at all times. Now, as I flew alone over the sea, these same feelings overwhelmed me with such suddenness and force that I became terrified. Had I really reached this stage? Psychological stability, as we were always taught, was a major requirement for a commander. Anyone unstable or prone to depression was unfit for command. My eyes travelled along the dashboard and stopped at the oil pressure gauge. Its reading surprised me by being unusual, but I still couldn't determine what it was showing. Why was the engine suddenly running louder? I must have blacked out for a few seconds. My head felt heavy, the headphones were hurting. I corrected course, checked the magneto and attached the oxygen mask, and wondered what would happen if I fell asleep. Would I be awakened by the aircraft's unusual behavior? Perhaps pure oxygen would help dissipate the deadly fatigue. In my trouser pocket was a cotton bag about 15 centimeters long, wrapped in cellophane and containing 5 or 6 milky white tablets about the size of a chocolate bar. They were labeled Pavitin. Dr. Sperling had told us that these tablets were designed to combat fatigue. Opening the packet, I pulled out first 2, and then a third, and moving my oxygen mask slightly, began to chew. They tasted horribly bitter and had the consistency of flour. But I had nothing to rinse my mouth with. From this point on, I hoped I would remain in a state of wakefulness. The engine was running smoothly and quietly. If it began to break, I should still be able to reach land near Cagliari. Then there would be a long flight over the sea, and it would no longer make any difference where I jumped out by parachute or where I landed the aeroplane on the water. Perhaps I could endure for 48 hours in a lifeboat, getting more and more severe sunburns, and then die of thirst and sunstroke. Nonsense. Why should the engine fail today and not some other day? Having seen the coast of Sicily, I intended to turn eastwards to keep out of the fighter track near Trapani. Ground control would let me know when the air was clear. The dots directly in front of me at the same altitude resembled Spitfires or Lightnings. Yes, they're Spitfires. 4, 6, and then I lost sight of them. I was alert, my heartbeat echoing in my ears. Why was the sky suddenly so bright? The bright light was blinding my eyes. If they were Spitfires, I had to get above them, a time-honoured rule. But what were Spitfires doing over the sea between Sardinia and Sicily? The glare was almost unbearable. but by covering my eyes with my free hand, I was able to see better. The engine was now making a great deal of noise, sounding as if it were over-revving, but all the gauges were undoubtedly showing normal values. Oil temperature, oil pressure, coolant temperature, RPM. Or was the RPM still too high? Out in the fog were aeroplanes. Strongholds, perhaps? They were flying the same course as me, and it took straining my eyes to see them. I lowered one wing slightly to look down, but the planes went into a steep roll. Then I lost sight of them. But when did I have time to get to 8,000 meters? I found it hard to breathe, and it was very cold in the cockpit, especially around my knees. I was flying above the high-altitude fog created by the Sirocco. The sun, a merciless yellow disk, shone through the cockpit roof and side windows, its strong light flooding everything that was usually in shadow. The instruments, the armament panel between my knees, the oxygen machine with the control indicator. Frosty patterns appeared on the cockpit windows, and ice crystals began to form in the corners. My eyes were glued to the altimeter and its fluorescent arrow, beneath which I could read the letters "do." The engine was now running melodiously, with a complete absence of vibration. Its sound was so quiet that there was a sense of silence. Everything became airy and abstract. It was as if I had left my body and was now flying above my aeroplane, watching the fastest German aeroplane rushing over the Mediterranean. The holder of the absolute speed record, pulled forward by the enormous power transmitted to its propeller. Elegant, with perfect streamlined forms, created by human hands for the purpose of destruction. It was an art to combine the thousands of horsepower of the engine with the propeller and rudders, to provide a perfect balance between speed and high-speed lift. The rudders responded to my movements, sharp, jerky, or so soft as to be barely perceptible. They could make the aeroplane dive, gain altitude, roll, or corkscrew, and they could make it crash if the wings proved incapable of resisting the overloads applied to them. It was then that I remembered something I had long since forgotten, the glorious, blissful sensation of flying. I had been trained on a Heinkel 52 biplane, and, perhaps for this reason, was still reluctant to put on an oxygen mask and take my 109th to altitudes where the rudders became sluggish and ineffective. Shortly before the outbreak of war, Messerschmitts began to replace biplanes, as the latter were nothing more than relics of the First World War and more suitable for description in novels about air flying than for participation in the new offensive for speed and altitude. In those days, we were unconcerned about the condition known as oxygen deprivation, regarding it as a short-lived and non-threatening weakness or a relatively safe imperfection of the human body. We were also still steeped in the romantic period of aviation, in no small part, because the garrison libraries were overflowing with literature about knights of the air whose only concerns were gallantry, sportsmanship, and truly honest one-on-one duels. In our hearts, we would not accept a closed-cockpit aeroplane because we felt trapped in it, and also because the trappings of the intrepid pilot, helmet, goggles, scarf flowing in the wind, leather sleeveless jacket with a thick fur collar, had to give way to more functional and therefore less dashing equipment. During our first exercise, we took off from the reserve aerodrome to fire from our hard-mounted machine guns at targets towed by a Junkers aircraft. There were 3 of us, all young lieutenants, and all belonged to the Naval Aviation Fighter Squadron. We treated fighter flying as a sport, similar to car racing, which combined aerobatics, aerial combat, and formation flying. During a break between exercises, our squadron commander suddenly remembered that we lieutenants had not yet passed the altitude test and ordered us to fly in a circle for 30 minutes at altitudes between 4,900 and 5,800 meters. Dressed like cavalrymen in breeches, elegant riding boots and brown leather sleeveless jackets with fur lining and fur collar, we sat down behind our windscreens and prepared to climb to altitude, which for the time was very significant. Without oxygen, mind you, each of us, of course, was anxious to fly higher than the others and prove that he had done so with the barograph mounted on the aeroplane. I still remember how there, in thin air, the flight was like a sailboat ride on the waves of the Atlantic, how my hands and feet felt terribly cold, how I gasped and suffered from incredible hallucinations. Back on land, we compared our barographs and boasted of our imaginary adventures, treating it generally as great entertainment. Later we, led by our squadron commander, took to the air to perform a close formation flight at an altitude of 5,500 meters. However, this exercise had to be interrupted, firstly because the commander was almost rammed by his wingman, and secondly because one of the biplanes went into an uncontrolled dive. When the pilot eventually regained control at 1,800 meters above the airfield, he had no idea what had happened to him. We were witnessing the irretrievable departure of the Romantic period and tried unsuccessfully to delay this movement, because we had not yet realized that this process alone was opening the way to even greater advances in aviation. Oxygen masks now had to be worn more and more frequently, as our engines reached their maximum efficiency only after we had climbed into layers of thinner air. At that time, the masks were clumsy items that severely restricted vision and movement. This caused a sudden frenzy to carve saxophone-like wooden mouthpieces that were attached to the end of the oxygen tube instead of the mask. Then the life-giving elixir could be gracefully inhaled like smoke from a Turkish hookah. But this affectation, of course, was nothing more than an unconscious defense reaction to the prosaic realism of the technology. Besides, it was considered rather good form to know nothing about the technicalities of the engine and to switch off the radio whenever it got in the way. Act A. In front of me, Mount Eris raised its head out of the fog like a friendly ghost. Thus I stayed strictly on course despite my state of euphoria and nonchalance and the feeling of weightlessness. The squadron command center once more came on the air, the words echoing loudly in my headphones. Attention! Twin-engined furniture vanses have passed Palermo, heading towards Trapani with a fighter escort. The message, however, seemed to have nothing to do with me, and I continued to remain quite unconcerned. The aerodrome, when I landed, seemed absolutely dead. No movement, not a soul. Beside the battered olive trees between the bomb craters were the pathetic ruins of hangars sticking up. It seemed as if I had arrived on the moon or some horrible planet. The dust from the last raid had barely settled. As I taxied towards the HQ parking area, my right tire blew out, probably because I had run over a bomb fragment. I switched off the engine and climbed out, while noting that no one had thought to help the squadron commander out of the car. The barracks, or what was left of it, was 100 meters away, and I walked towards it in the blazing sun. The staff clerk, who looked at me as if I were a ghost, greeted me and reported that an air alert had been received from Mount Eris a minute before my arrival, and that the attack had been directed mainly against 88mm anti-aircraft guns. Some time later, meeting Hauptmann Sperling, I asked him what the dreaded substance pervitin was and suggested that the pilots should be warned about it. When he found out that I had taken 3 pills one after the other, he almost became hysterical and forbade me for the rest of the day to touch the aircraft, even from the outside. That same day 3 new recruits joined the squadron. They flew to Vibo Valentia, an aerodrome at the toe of Italy, and from there travelled by ferry to Messina, arriving in time for the first day's raid. They then travelled by hitchhiking to Trapani. 2 of the lieutenants were about 20 years old, the third non-commissioned officer even younger. During the report they kept a very straight face and generally gave a manly impression. Our needs dictated that the officers should be assigned to Group 1 and the non-commissioned officer to Group 2. Each month, the training and combat group sent us enough pilots to make up for our losses. But now it was no longer possible to keep the replenishment numbers high, and in any case we couldn't really use them. To allow them to take part in sorties here meant endangering not only them but also others. As Bachmann said, we can't let them go like lambs to the slaughter. It was no longer possible to gradually introduce newly arrived pilots into combat. Spitfires, Kitty Hawks, and Lightnings were almost constantly over our airfields, and yet we were unable to teach them the methods of attacking the fortresses, because none of them had the skill and experience required to fly in our close formation. They're extremely young, Struden remarked after their report. You mean we're getting more and more young, Bachman said. I'd give a lot to know what they're thinking when they arrive here. It's a shame we can't ask them, and obviously they're not going to say anything about their own thoughts. They're too insecure for that. Again, as we have often done before, we began to discuss their faces, their behavior, and their general appearance. And once again, as we had done on many previous occasions, we summarized by making predictions about their future, which, for the most part, were wrong, and by this time I should have known that attempts to classify people were fruitless, because the gifted, successful fighter pilots did not belong to any particular, recognizable type. It was a great temptation to single out those for whom anyone felt immediate sympathy because of their natural gifts. But manly appearance and confident behavior rarely coincided with success in flying as a fighter pilot. There was one occasion in Tunisia when two new non-commissioned officers, mere boys, came to report to me. Outwardly they were completely different, and it soon became apparent that they acted quite differently in the air also, whereas one of them, an athletically built lad with a straight posture, gazed attentively and earnestly into my eyes with his blue eyes. The other looked round cautiously, as if making an inventory of the property of my living van. Unlike his companion, he was small, lean and wry, and his head was crowned with a huge mop of hair, in the style of William Bush's barbers. He reminded me of Bush caricatures every time I looked at him. I can't believe who they're sending us, I remarked to Bachman as we looked at the departing couple. Look at that scrawny little fellow. And how can he expect to attack and shoot down aeroplanes when the whole sky is hell? Yes, said Bachman. I too vote only for the tall blonde man. I would suggest that he's a good, brave player and generally more likable. A day later I was sitting with Bachman, Struden and Sang in front of a tent on the edge of the airfield, waiting for the command to take off. These two rookies were trying out their aeroplanes, practicing landing and taking off, a necessary precaution before they were put into action. Bachman and I were doing paperwork, lounger chatter as he called it. He would hand me papers, orders, and folders, making a few accompanying comments about each one, while I read, dictated, signed, and instructed. Whenever the increasing engine noise indicated that an aircraft was approaching the landing signal strip, I would interrupt and see it off with my eyes. No flying unit commander can fail to watch when one of his pilots comes in for a landing. A landing is the critical moment when controlled flight abruptly ends and a brief uncontrolled situation ensues that is neither flying nor taxiing. There are good landings, and there are bad ones, some consisting of a series of violent bounces, and others are simply a violent collision of the aircraft with the ground. A pilot once said, with a sense of humour, that flying involves landing, while an Englishman, his colleague except at the opposite landing place, whom we hosted in our officers' mess after a forced landing on the Channel coast, remarked of his manoeuvre, "Any landing after which you stay alive is a good one." The sight of aircraft landing has always attracted my attention, and my interest was, of course, particularly keen when a newcomer was familiarizing himself with his machine. I was watching the landing approach and jumped up in fright when Bachman shouted, "Hey, he forgot the landing gear. Look, Herr Major, he's forgotten his wheels." At that moment the propeller struck the ground, and the aeroplane skidded along on its belly until it stopped, raising a cloud of dust. "Let's go," I shouted. We jumped into the Kubelwagen and rushed to the scene of the accident. There we saw a picture that took my breath away. The pilot, kneeling next to a pathetic object with bent propeller blades, was trying to fit the damaged aircraft into the viewfinder of his camera. It was our barber. "Idiot," I yelled at him. "You really must be hopeless. You crashed one of our priceless 109ths. Every aircraft here is worth its weight in gold, and you come and tear it apart just because you can't use your five senses. And now, after all this, what motivates you to photograph this monument to incompetence?" He looked at me completely stunned, and stammering with excitement, said something about remembering, and that he would be more careful next time. As we drove back, I said to Bachman, "Hey, let Freytag check better and see if we can send the barber back home. I said at once that there would be no use for that boy. Some time later, perhaps a week later, we met up with our old friends, the marauders from Tebes, who this time had no Spitfire escort. Their attacks on our airfields had become too brazen recently, and they seemed to have no fear of our fighters. This time we were able to restore our shattered reputation in the eyes of our adversaries by breaking up their battle order and pursuing one by one at low altitude over the desert. Over Kara Ranum, we encountered a strong patrol of fighters. Having a speed advantage, the Spitfires spun on us to force us to stop pursuing the bombers. The merry-go-round of the Me and Spitfight began, a huge spiral spinning anti-clockwise. Spitfires spiked, and the sides separated to gain altitude and return on counter-courses, firing their weapons. For some time no one could make any headway. Then I saw a Me being attacked by 2 Spitfires. The pilot went into a steep dive, then gracefully leveled the aircraft, began to gain altitude, and with a maneuver that indicated perfect flying skills, took up a position behind one of his pursuers and shot it down with a short burst. After we had landed, I asked who the marksman was, and, to my surprise, heard that it was our barber who had damaged the aircraft at the time. Freytag, to whose group he belonged at the time, confirmed that he was a gifted pilot and predicted a great future for him as a fighter pilot. Apparently he was one of those jolly fellows who were always cheerful, easygoing, and easily won the sympathy of others. He did indeed soon win a second victory, but then met his end under ghastly circumstances. When, on the eve of our evacuation from Tunisia, he turned onto a narrow runway in the afternoon, about to take off, he was rammed by a fighter plane making an emergency landing from the opposite direction. He died a horrible death from burns in his cockpit. Acte. In the afternoon I tried to rest so that I could at least take part in the evening sortie. But I could not stay long on my cot in the villa. My heart was beating hard, and an inexplicable feeling of nervousness kept me awake. I had to move, to do something. So I spent my time preparing for the withdrawal that now seemed inevitable. If no withdrawal order came, I intended to make the decision myself, depending on the situation. Together with Hauptmanns Kegel and Tarnow, my administrative and technical officers, I checked the loading lists of the transport and found that even if it was loaded to the maximum, there was only enough room to transfer our ground staff to Messina. Consequently, the tonnes of material, all the spares and equipment, which we had begun to claim from the depots immediately after our withdrawal from North Africa, and which had just been handed over to us, would have to be destroyed again to keep them out of enemy hands. As we sat down to supper, the heavy ship's artillery began firing again. The explosions made the house shake and the windows rattle. Soon the night bombers also appeared, and we went to the grotto as we did every evening. Fighter pilots. We were used to spending our nights there, discussing our daytime activities. Soon all was quiet and we felt relatively safe, provided of course that some foolish bomber didn't cover the villa with an accidental hit. We all tried to use the short hours of darkness to sleep. The drug was obviously still circulating in my veins as I continued to toss and turn restlessly on my cot. Again and again I mentally went through the withdrawal sequence, doubting that the squadron with its pilots and aircraft would still represent a viable fighting unit when we reached the mainland. This time we couldn't even salvage the toolboxes. The orgy of destruction was to begin in the next few days, and if we could reassemble the squadron at Fojas, it would take months to provide replacements for the 1,001 items needed for the operations of a fighter squadron. Aircraft, tools, lifting equipment, tents, engines, spare parts, cooking equipment, radios, telephones, typewriters. The phone rang. Hauptmann Kegel reported that Major Tunn, commander of the fighter-bomber squadron, was on his way to the grotto. He had parachuted out of his Focke-Wulf after a squadron of Lightnings had attacked him near Corleone and shot up his engine. A little while later, Fatty led Tunn to the grotto. Leaning on a thick stick and limping, he entered and introduced himself. With an objecting gesture, he interrupted my apologies for the primitive and sleeping-filled room. I suggested we go to the villa when the bombardment subsided to sleep for a few hours. The major was a full, stout, muscular-looking man with short-cropped curly hair. He resembled a peasant, and one of his most pleasing features was his dark, kind eyes. Without delay, he began the story. Around about noon, we attacked the ships near Jailer. It is always a good moment when your bomb is gone and you can, by leveling your aeroplane and gaining altitude, be out of reach of the murderous fire from the ships. That's when we ran into the lightnings. But how did you end up near Trapani, if you're based at Jabini? As I told you, we were jumped by lightnings. With the few airworthy planes we could scrape together, we dived from 4,900 meters carrying one 500K bomb each. The sea was dotted with excellent targets. His voice was too loud and gruff and woke those in the deck chairs and on the cot, who now seated, watched him with interest. They immediately appeared behind us and began to pursue us at low altitude as we flew over the valley to the interior of the island. This culminated in a series of single bouts. Fortunately, the Focke-Wulf is certainly not a weakling. I saw several aircraft going down, but had to save my own skin. I turned north to get rid of them. I tried everything, looping through valleys and jumping over mountains, but the lightnings kept behind me. Eventually, they got into firing range and damaged my aircraft, but before they could finally finish me off, I gained altitude and parachuted out. I was surprised they didn't fire on me while I was dangling from my parachute. I landed near a little town called Corleone. It's south of Palermo, about 60 kilometers in a straight line. Corleone means spirit of the lion, and I think that's pretty accurate. I then walked and managed to get on an Italian lorry. All along the road are Italian army trucks with unusual-looking civilians on board. In other words, the glorious Italian Sixth Army advancing home to Malta. What does Gabini look like? We're going to fly out there tomorrow? The airfield is overcrowded like arable land in autumn. They dropped bombs everywhere, like they wanted to destroy the whole area meter by meter. We had to take off almost hourly and move our aeroplanes if necessary, hiding in the gaps in the stubble. Then all the fields around us caught fire, and the fire drove us out. Only a few aeroplanes from the squadron are still airworthy, and we can't do much damage to the enemy with one miserable bomb hanging under the belly of each of them. If you've seen a Boeing opening the bomb hatch flaps and what falls out of it, that's what I call efficiency. Do you think we'll still be able to land at Jabini tomorrow morning? How will we be able to cover the ferry traffic if there are no aerodromes left to the east? He shook his round head doubtfully. You can land if you arrive before the first wave of bombers. The commandant has men from the working units rebuilding the runways during the night as much as possible within the time the night bombers give them. We plan to hit the ships with 1,000-kilogram bombs. We would certainly have sent several of them to the bottom if we hadn't been outgunned one by one. By the time the enemy landed on the island, my squadron had already been put out of action, wrecked on the ground. Now we are being shown how we should have fought the battle over England in 1941, with the aircraft we needed to do so. I've just read the tutorial. It's usually the last thing I do. This Level 6C describes so precisely how it should be done. It was written personally by General Wefer,